Today's episode is going to be focused on fisheries management. So we're going to find out about tuna, folks. It's going to be a really great episode to say, hey, look, what's going on with tuna fishing? Should we be eating tuna? Should we not be eating tuna? What type of tuna should we be eating? How many species are fished? We're going to find out all about that because we have Dr. Victor Restrepo, who is from the International Seafood Sustainability Foundation, the ISSF. They've just released a report called Snapshot of Large-Scale Tuna Purse Seine Fishing Vessels or Fleets that just came out in June 2024. I've been working with them to get a podcast episode out to talk about sort of the number of vessels that have changed, how many are out there, where they're from, what country they're flying. So you're going to hear all about fishing and just the intricacies of fishing and what needs to be monitored and what needs to be done to actually get a better fishing overall. And Victor is on the podcast to talk about that. We talk a lot about things like what he thinks should happen, how surprised he's that there hasn't been a really increase in vessels, but also he's kind of disappointed there hasn't been a decrease in vessels. It's going to be really cool to hear all about tuna fishing. So that's what we're going to do today on today's episode. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And on today's episode, just like a lot of our other episodes, knowledge is power. You're here to find out how you can protect the ocean. That's why I named the podcast the way it's named. And we're going to find out. We're going to find out how to protect the ocean when it comes to tuna fishing and tuna fisheries in general. Dr. Victor Restrepo is on the podcast today. He's been involved in tuna fisheries management from 1992 to the present day. He knows a ton about the industry. He's seen how these regional fishing management areas or organizations have been set up and what they need to do to make them better. He has a lot of knowledge and experience within the tuna fishing industry and science. And we're going to be hearing all about the science and kind of what he sees where the industry needs to go to really help, and how processing companies like tuna processing companies are really at the forefront of helping make science part of fisheries management more and more and more. So we're going to talk all about that today. I'm really, really excited for you to hear this interview. And if you want, I'm going to be putting up links to the report. I'm going to put links to the organization so that you can get more information on the International Seafood Sustainability Foundation. But in the meantime, here is the interview with Dr. Restrepo talking about the report, Snapshot of Large-Scale Tuna Purse Seine Fishing Fleets. It's a really long title, but it's a great report and it's a great interview. So enjoy, and I will talk to you after. Hey, Victor, welcome to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about tuna fishing?
I definitely am ready, Andrew. Let's do it.
Right on. Let's do this. This is going to be a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to doing this. We're going to be talking about a specific report here with you, Victor, that came out in June of this year of 2024. It's called Snapshot of Large-Scale Tuna Purse Seine Fishing Fleets. This is going to be a really interesting report, just kind of an update on what's happening with the tuna fishing. And so we're going to get an update on like number of vessels that are there, how much is actually being taken, what kind of conservation measures are there that's going to happen and happening right now. It's going to be really great. I'm really, really excited for it. But before we get into that, Victor, why don't you just let us know who you are and what you do?
Okay, my name is Victor Restrepo. I have a PhD from the University of Miami on stock assessment methods, and I have been involved in tuna science since about 1991. I have a lot of experience in the US government with NOAA at the University of Miami, and also internationally in the so-called Tuna Regional Fishery Management Organizations, or RFMOs in short.
Right.
And I've been involved with them for the last, since 1999 or so.
Okay, so you've seen quite a lot of changes over your time, during this time. I mean, tuna fishing has been, it feels like it's been going up and down. This is not me citing any data or anything like that, but it just feels in the news. Like sometimes there's some tuna fish that are on the brink of extinction. Other times they're doing well. Can you kind of give us like a little bit of a snapshot over your time, what you've seen in terms of tuna fishing in general? I know there's a lot of species, and I know that's kind of a loaded question to ask, but there's sort of just the trends that you've seen over that time.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent question, Andrew. Bluefin tuna, there are 3 species of bluefin tuna, and in 23 stocks of major commercial tunas.
Okay.
And they account for only 1% of the catch.
Okay.
But they account for 99% of the noise.
Okay,
So,
interesting. Okay.
so a lot of the words, when you hear the word extinction or something like that, it's usually a bluefin tuna stock that the media or whoever is talking about.
Gotcha.
And they have been overfished in the past because bluefin tuna in the sashimi market is one of the most expensive fishes. You know, an individual bluefin could cost $70,000 or $100,000. So they have been the subject of illegal fishing and very, very high fishing pressure. But I have seen that turn around since about 2009. There have been major changes in the management of the bluefin tunas of the world. And I would say that the situation is not totally, out of danger completely, but all of the stocks have turned around one way or the other, and the catches are growing and the stocks are getting healthier.
Interesting. That's really interesting. So, and you've been a part of this for quite some time, in different, when you worked for NOAA, were you just working on American species? Because I know with NOAA, they tend to work with other countries internationally, like in the Pacific. I know that they look at, with sharks, they look at different sort of regions with like RMOs. RFMOs. They look at different RFMOs like in the Pacific. Is that the same thing with tuna with when you worked with NOAA, or was that
Exactly.
more locally?
No, it was just like that, but it was more in the Atlantic. So
Okay.
there are 5 tuna RFMOs. There are 2 in the Pacific,
Right.
1 in the Atlantic, 1 in the Indian Ocean, and 1 in the Southern Hemisphere.
Okay. Okay.
And I used to work for the Atlantic one,
Okay.
both in the Secretariat and with NOAA as a U.S. scientist that came to the meetings.
Gotcha. And that was more like, that was just not, one species of bluefin. It was like all the tuna that were involved there, right?
Right, absolutely.
Okay. And from a term of fishing gear, can you just explain to the audience, how tuna are typically fished, like commercially?
Yes. The major fishing method for all tunas is seining, and
Okay.
this is basically a boat that makes a set around a school of tunas, and they close the bottom of the net. That's the purse, and then they haul it out and take
Right.
the catch. And the majority of the catch by seiners is of so-called tropical tunas. There are 3 species: skipjack tuna, big-eye tuna, and yellowfin tuna. And if you like to eat tuna in a can, chances are it was caught by seining.
Okay.
On a few occasions, they are caught by longliners, which are baited hooks.
Right.
But that's really only for albacore tuna. Most of the tropical tunas are caught by seiners.
Okay. Okay. Now, with purse seining, from my understanding in the past, and again, I'm not so familiar with this subject matter, which is why I'm happy to have you on. My understanding is that purse seining in some cases have allowed other animals to get in as bycatch, in particular dolphins. They're out now. When you look at a can, it says dolphin free, tuna catching. Can you just talk a little bit about how that all came to be, and sort of what's the status of purse seining when it comes to bycatch and catching other animals?
All tuna fishing gears have some level of bycatch. Maybe not harpooning or something like that. That is very, very, very specific. But
Yeah.
everything else takes bycatch. And in fact, longline fisheries take a lot more bycatch than purse seine
Right.
fisheries do.
Right.
But the mix of species that they take is different. When it comes to dolphins, this is really a phenomenon that mostly happens in the Eastern Pacific Ocean, where
Okay.
dolphins associate with tunas. And the
Okay.
two schools kind of mix together.
Oh, I see.
And there are some purseine vessels, not U.S. vessels, from some other flags that are very good at spotting the dolphins from very far away using helicopters and other
Right.
signs. And they know that if they find dolphins, they'll find tuna. So they
Gotcha.
catch both and they let the dolphins go, although some of them die sometimes, and then they keep the tuna catch. But that's really only in the Eastern Pacific Ocean. It's
Okay.
not a practice that occurs commonly anywhere else.
Okay. It seems as though, when we, and I hear this from the media a lot of the time. So it seems like when we talk about, tuna fishing and we talk about, overfish stocks, we talk about the whole dolphin issue that happens. It seems like a lot of times that gets grouped in with all tuna fishing, from the people who consume it or people who are talking about it, because they get it confused with, Eastern Pacific fishing, where you have, dolphin associations, and then, just a small percentage of the total catch of tuna is bluefin tuna, and you're just like, hey, that's not even that much, and it's, it's very small. Why do you think that is? Why do you think it gets so confusing with, when we talk about the communication of this type of data?
Well, things are complicated, and one of the things that we try to do in ISSF is to explain complicated things in
Right.
ways that are easier to understand. But I have to admit that I don't think we can ever explain something in one sentence, because there
No,
is not such a thing.
for
But
sure.
but bad news are very easy to say in one sentence. It's very difficult to describe something that is quite complex in just a few words. But if you put it as bad news, it's quite easy. So
It's going to
that's
be
the
bad.
difficulty that we face all of the time. Thank goodness we have very, very good communications people working with us. So I'm a scientist. I'm a little bit complicated myself. I try to simplify things as much as I can, but I can only go
Yeah.
so far. And then our communications people are just magnificent at taking, where I leave it and taking
Yeah.
it to the next step in simplifying it with infographics or other means.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I feel when it comes to communication, it can be very difficult to sort of separate the ifs and the buts from our results. As scientists, you have these scientists, but then there's always a caveat, and there's always, something else, and there's always some external sort of force coming in to make it even more complicated and stuff. So I think it's really interesting, and I completely agree with you. It's never an easy byline to just put out, being like, hey, tuna are doing great, or tuna are not doing so great, and so forth. So I think that's really interesting. With that said, we're talking about this report, Snapshot of Large-Scale Tuna Purseine Fishing Fleets. Now, this is like a fleet that's monitored in a report. I understand one came out in 2023 in June, and this one came out in June 2024. So this is an annual report that looks at this type of commercial fishing. Is that correct?
Yes, we have updated that report 12 times altogether. So I
Oh, okay.
guess we started in 2012 or something like that.
Okay.
And each year we look at we use different sources of data.
Right.
One of them is the list of vessels that are authorized in every RFMO,
Okay.
but we also use other types of information. And a lot of changes happen between one year and the next when it comes to vessels. They change flags, they change names, they change the radio call sign, they
Right.
change many things. They move to other oceans and so on. And so we keep track of that. There are also some vessels that sink, some that are scrapped,
Right.
some new ones are built, and so on. So our job is to make that snapshot around June every year
Okay.
with all the changes that happened.
And what's the reason for vessels? Obviously, vessels that are scrapped and obviously sink. That's dangerous. It's the danger of being in the ocean all the time. What would be the advantage or the reason for boats changing flags or changing countries where they originate from? Is it just they get bought over, or what's the reasoning for that?
I think in most cases it's because they have more access to the resources because the particular country that they're reflagging to has, let's say, a quota or a
Gotcha.
number of fishing days that they can use to
Oh, I see.
basically have a joint venture with a vessel owner and then reflag the vessel. And so it's business convenience, I would say, in most of the cases.
Okay, I got you. And now these are all legally registered vessels that you're looking at. There are cases of illegal fishing, but this report focuses on the ones that you can track, the ones that you know are there, and the differences. You say there's changes between like boats, the number of boats, the capacity, and all that. So out of this year, let's say compared to last year, what were the major differences in the number of boats, or the differences in the number of boats?
I think that the number of, I don't remember all of the details offhand,
Okay.
but I think that the numbers didn't change much. But there
Right.
were a lot of changes, like there were additions and there were deletions and there was reflagging.
Yeah.
But overall, they stayed around 650 vessels. Now, we're
Okay.
talking about very large vessels. We're talking
Right.
about vessels that can carry like more than 400 tons of tuna in a given
Wow.
trip.
Okay.
And usually they're vessels larger than 55 or 60 meters long.
Right.
So
Right.
they're
Yeah.
not that easy to hide and they're not that easy to become illegal.
Right. Of course.
They are monitored by different means. They are
Yeah.
insured. They're super expensive vessels. One of those
Yeah.
new vessels could cost 30 or 40 billion dollars. Once it's fully equipped. So
Wow.
these
Okay.
these
And then
are
plus the crew and everything like that. Like you're looking at
exactly.
a fairly significant business operation happening
Exactly.
with these vessels. Okay.
Yes.
And then now for the monitoring of, to ensure that they're catching the right catch and so forth, are there fisheries observers on these ships?
On purse-seiners,
Yeah.
in every ocean for tropical tuna purse-seiners, which is what we're talking about in that report,
Yes.
there are observers 100% of the time on these vessels, except in the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean only requires 5%
Okay.
coverage, but most of the vessel owners have voluntarily agreed to 100% as well. In
Okay.
some cases, because the markets demand it, not so
Yeah.
much the regulations.
Gotcha. So there's like the people who they're selling to require 100% coverage for
Exactly.
observers. Okay, that's good. That's good to hear. That's nice that they're going kind of above and beyond what they're supposed to. It's nice that other sort of lines within the supply chain are demanding that. So that's always nice. So what can you tell me about this report in terms of sort of results that you've seen, changes you've seen either from last year or that you've noticed that kind of stood out to you?
Well, one of the things that I have noticed is frustrating because it hasn't changed. It's not so much about the change that I'm going to talk about, but about
Okay.
something that doesn't change. And that is that many of the vessels are authorized to fish in several RFMOs during the same year. They
Okay.
don't necessarily fish in two or more RFMOs, but they're authorized to fish in two or more of the RFMOs. So it's difficult to envisage a system where that fishing capacity could be managed globally because there are no restricted vessel records in each of the RFMOs, which is something that I find frustrating. And it would be
Right.
ideal if they could control the floodgates, let's say, of vessels that could move easily from one ocean to the other or one
Right.
ocean side to the other.
Because there's a period where you could have a number of vessels in one RFMO instead of spreading them out over, like only restricting them only to certain RFMOs, because maybe there's more of a concentration of tuna in that area. Is that what you're concerned about?
Yeah, I'm concerned that there are too many purse-seiners already that can catch. I mean, the catch that they make, they could make easily with maybe half of the number of vessels that are out there. So it's not only an economic inefficiency,
Right.
it's waste, and that overcapacity is always a pressure point for fishing harder and fishing harder, and
Right.
then requiring more regulations, and it's just making everything more difficult. And I wish we could manage capacity globally in a meaningful way, but having these multiple registers is not very useful.
Yeah, agreed. With that said, can they does each boat have a specific quota that they can catch?
It depends on the RFMO.
Okay.
Some of them, the flag state usually has a number of fishing days assigned to them or a
Okay.
quota assigned to them. And then it's that country that subdivides that catch quota or the number of fishing days into the different vessels that make up their fisheries. And
Gotcha.
the systems are quite different in all of the oceans. They're perhaps a little bit more similar in the Indian and Atlantic Oceans, but then
Right.
everything else is much more different.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's interesting too because if you think about it, if one boat has access to a number of different RFMOs, then they can go into one, fish their quota, and then go back into another and fish their other quota, and then if they can go to another, they can continue to fish, which almost kind of defeats the purpose of keeping catch limits, right?
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on the flag state that has to regulate them, and the flag state has to decide if they do give them permission or not to move to different RFMOs during the same year. If they
Gotcha.
can manage that internally, they will.
They will, yeah. Now, but they because some vessels have access to a number of different ones. Can one country that has control over that, or the countries that have control over their RFMO, can they tell what the others have, what each boat has caught in other RFMOs? Do they know that
If they belong to their flag, yes.
if they belong to the flag? Gotcha.
Otherwise, generally not.
Okay.
Generally, the catches are only known in the aggregate for an entire country and fishing type. So you might know what the catch by U.S. flagged tourist sailors was in the Western Pacific last year,
Right.
but you won't know what each individual vessel caught.
Right. Because they can go over to the different. How do we get a regulation, or how do we get countries to only allow their flagship to, catch in one RFMO? How does that? Where does that have to come from?
I don't think that it necessarily has to happen like that,
Okay.
but I think it has to happen in an agreed management situation where all of the countries decide how to go about it collectively. So
Gotcha.
I don't think it's so much something that one individual country can accomplish. It's a collective effort.
Got you. And are there committees, or are there sort of collaborations where countries get together to talk about tuna catches?
Only within an RFMO currently. So
Gotcha. Okay.
that's what they do. Basically, the RFMOs have a scientific committee structure, and then
Right.
on top of that, they have a political decision-making structure, and that's basically all they do. But
Right.
they cannot work between RFMOs at the same time with several RFMOs. They only do it within one at a
That's
time.
interesting. So it's almost like they're just siloed into these different, countries and RFMOs. Interesting. Okay. What else from that report stood out to you as you participated in it?
Well, I'm surprised that the number of vessels has not increased a lot over these last 12 years. I mean, it has hovered around 640 to 670
Okay.
all of this time. So that's good. I wish that they had decreased somehow, but at least they have been more or less stable over time.
And what do you think the reasons for that is? Is it just, I mean, it's expensive to have these boats. Is it more of there's not enough catch out there? There's not enough interest out there. It seems like tuna's very popular. So what do you think the reason why it hasn't ballooned out to above 270? I mean, I think I'm looking at numbers here. Just found the numbers from last year was 650. This year was 652. So not much difference when you look at the range that you just mentioned. Why do you think it hasn't, increased by so much?
I think it's partly costs. It's partly limited resources. I mean, they have quotas in place or limit in the number of days and so on. So I guess I'm not an expert in economics
Right.
of fishing vessels, but I
Right.
guess they must do the math and figure out that it's a tremendous investment
Yeah.
for that type of activity. There are also regulations in place that are not necessarily from the RFMOs. Like, for example, ISSF has a number of conservation measures, and one of them has to do with new fishing capacity, like new vessels being constructed without scrapping old vessels. So all of the processing companies that work with us, they are committed to only source tuna from port seiners that meet the criteria of that conservation measure. So
Okay.
it's not only the RFMOs, it's also other conservation-driven forces from the markets.
Okay. Now, I probably should have asked this right at the beginning, but you do work for the International Seafood Sustainability Foundation, and it sounds like you guys are connecting the sort of the tuna fishing sort of industry with sort of the right guidance for tuna fishing in general, or just seafood in general. Can you just talk about the purpose of the ISSF and sort of how it works within the market and how it's helped?
That's a long question to answer. but basically, what we do is everything is science driven at some point.
Right.
Science is where we start, and it has to do a lot with the status of the stocks, and what conservation measures we can try to use to influence the fishing industry to reduce bycatch, to reduce other environmental impacts, to reduce the use of fish aggregating devices. These are something that port seiners use a lot to attract tunas. Fish aggregating devices that are not biodegradable, for example, or that are entangling. So
Right.
we have a number of conservation measures that the participating companies that work with us are committed to follow. Now, the conservation measures are adopted by the ISSF board, which is composed by a mix of different people, including scientists, people from environmental NGOs, people closer to the fishing industry, and so on. So it's a good spread of people that make those decisions. And then the participating companies have to follow those conservation measures that we adopt.
Okay. Okay. And sort of how do you attract these companies? Like, do you go out when do you have people within the organization that goes out and builds those relationships with the different companies within the industry?
These are processing companies that we're talking about, not fishing companies.
Sorry, processing companies. Yeah.
Yeah. And the universe of processing companies is not huge compared to the universe of fishing vessels.
Gotcha.
So
Okay.
it's a much smaller universe. And basically, I understand that when ISSF was born, I wasn't there back in 2008 or 2009. There was already a group of processing companies that were very much aligned in saying we need the RFMOs to pay more attention to the science. We need things to be more scientifically sound. So I think that coalition already existed back then with a large number of companies.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I've been getting involved in, people have been coming to me to share stories, or I've seen stories online that I've wanted to cover on the podcast. And it's very interesting when a new issue has arisen, that people are discovering and they're researching and so forth. And they're trying to put, some together, trying to have like a call to action together. The first thing I look for is like, is there anybody out there that's part of the industry that's willing to, stand up and have these values where they want to protect whatever they're like in your case, it would be the processors that want to protect the fish that they're processing. They want to make sure it's sustainable for the years to come. So they have these values where they get together. And as you mentioned, before the ISSF was born, they had these kind of committees where like, we need to do something better. Here comes the ISSF being like, hey, we'll help you do that. We'll help you follow the science. We'll help research and do the science on it so that you can make better decisions. How important for you as a scientist do you think it is when companies, like even the processors, have these values that they want to be like, we need to follow the science more? How important is that to you as a scientist?
it's very important. I have been involved, like I said, with RFMOs for many, many years,
Yeah.
initially as a scientist, but then also going to the more political decision making meetings.
Hmm.
And over time, I have seen a big change about who makes up the delegations of the different member countries to the RFMOs. And when I first started, it was largely the fishing industry
Hmm.
themselves.
Hmm.
And the RFMOs are all about flag state responsibilities. So they were very directly linked to whatever activities were going to be managed. And over time, I have seen a lot more involvement from the processing sector and even from
Hmm.
the marketing sector. And now you have, in the RFMOs, you have letters that are signed requesting the Commission to do something,
Right.
like adopting harvest control rules or other types of management measures that are more modern. And these letters are signed by 120 or 150 different groups, including processors and fishing associations and environmental NGOs
Right.
and people from universities. And so it's really amazing how the advocacy has
Hmm.
changed over time.
That's awesome. That's great to hear. Now, obviously, we still have a lot of work to do in terms of conserving these wonderful fish and just making sure that everything, all stakeholders are included, and there's a lot more voices at the table. Where do you see the industry moving in the future? Do you think are you optimistic about tuna fishing in the future based on sort of how things have changed so far and sort of who's involved at the decision making level and who wants to be involved? Are you optimistic of the future, or do you still think we have a ton of work to do, or a little bit of both?
Well, the ton of work will never go away.
Right.
Fisheries management is a very tedious thing,
Right.
and it's complicated, like we were talking about before. But there are more players on the table now. Before, it was all the RFMO members and what they
Mm-hmm.
could do as flag states. Now
Mm-hmm.
you have other things. You have other pressure points, like the case of ISSF,
Yeah.
or you have fisheries that want to be certified by the Marine Stewardship Council, for example,
Yes.
and that's another way of bringing change
Yeah.
about. And in fact, the Marine Stewardship Council requirements have pushed the RFMOs to make a lot of changes so that their regulations fit within the MSC system in a better way. So
Yeah.
it's not just the RFMOs that are working at it alone now. There's a
Yeah.
series of activities ongoing at the same time.
And let's be honest, better guidance. You have more people at the table. You have a lot more experts at the table that are looking at various angles of fisheries management, which we know is a big deal. And so it's nice to see that we're getting more and more people involved. Better guidance for different aspects of the industry, and so we can move forward in a great way. One thing that I always ask sort of at the end as we talk about large sort of management decisions is how can people I have people in my audience who want to help the ocean, right? That's why they come to this how to protect the ocean. How do you think individuals can get involved within the industry here and just kind of help out? Is it more of supporting the organizations that are involved, getting more awareness involved? Like, what would you recommend? Like, if somebody asked you just off the street, how can I help with tuna fishing? What's the best way they can do as individuals?
Well, I would say that it's very important that we all become more knowledgeable about what's going on, even if the facts are complicated.
Right. Right.
And, you know, I would say education is the first thing. Now, if the person as a consumer wants to use that knowledge to make decisions about what tuna to purchase and what tuna not to purchase, for example, that's
Yep.
one way of
Yep.
helping out, and hopefully rewarding the fisheries that are doing very well their job,
Yes.
and not rewarding the ones that are not such good actors. So I think at the consumer level, that's probably the best thing.
Yep.
And of course, if they're wealthy, they could contribute to organizations that are helping out as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Victor, this has been such an amazing time. I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to, letting us know, giving us a lot of information about the report, but also about tuna fisheries in general, demystifying some of the things that I think we all think about. And it's just really nice to see the conservation work that you're doing along with, with the ISSF. And I look forward to having you back on the podcast to get more updates on tuna fishing.
Thank you, Andrew. I'd be happy to. And I really thank you for your questions. They're all very good.
Very nice. Thank you. Thank you, Victor, for joining us here on the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. It was great to know that knowledge is power. I think it's so funny to be like, it's so complicated to protect the ocean, right? We talked about the complexities with Victor. He says you can't just do like a one byline on a headline and just be like, this is how you protect tuna fisheries. No, it's really difficult. It's complex. There are a lot of complexities from, managing different countries, interests, to managing different companies' interests, to managing different companies and different sort of functions within the supply chain and everything. But it's been great to see how people have gotten more knowledge on these fisheries, and then they're able to contribute to the decision process. At the beginning with these RFMOs, there was only tuna fishing boats. Now there are a lot of different companies that are involved. There is the Marine Stewardship Council that's involved. There's the ISSF that's involved. There's other NGOs that are involved. And so people who are supporting these NGOs, give them the power and give them the opportunity to be at the table for these decision-making opportunities so that they can have an influence on how tuna fishing is measured. I think it was also interesting how Victor talked about, dolphins and tuna fish, and how, some dolphins have been able to get into tuna fish, but that's only in one fishery or a couple of fisheries on the Pacific East Coast, or the Eastern Pacific, sorry. And so I think that's interesting to hear. And other tuna fishing, they don't have that problem because the tuna and the dolphins are not associated together. It's just in one particular area, one particular part of the world. I think it's interesting how, we saw, fishing fleets in the Indian Ocean having 100% coverage of fisheries observers when they only needed 5%. But because the processing companies demand that they have 100%, now they do 100%. I think it's just interesting to show the influence that people have within the supply chain. And if your values are good and you want to be sustainable and you want to see this fishery happen for a long term, that you can have that. And it doesn't necessarily mean we have to completely shut down a fishery, is we can work within that and change. Unfortunately, change can be slow. And that's where we need to really put more pressure on, the different suggestions that scientists have and that policymakers have to make sure those policies go through and we get a better managed fishery and a more sustainable fishery. So again, Victor, thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank Taylor, who was their communications person, who set this all up and reached out to me at the beginning of the summer to get this set up. I want to thank her as well. And I want to thank you for listening to this episode. I think it's a really interesting one. I think we're just kind of scratching the surface with this type of work. This is something I've been wanting to do for quite some time. Bring to light these reports, this information, so that you can make better decisions on how you want to protect the ocean. So I think it's really fun to do. Anyway, if you want to leave a comment or have a question regarding this report or regarding this episode, you can do so. You can leave it on Spotify. Now they allow comments. You can go to YouTube because this video will be on YouTube. And of course, you can reach out to me on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean, just at How to Protect the Ocean, all one word. Just DM me. I'd love to hear from you. And of course, if you're listening to this on any podcast app, your favorite podcast app, just share it around with other people so that they can listen to this too if they want to know how to protect the ocean. If they're asking that question, like, how can I do this? I don't even know. It's so complicated. I don't know where to begin. This is the podcast that they need to be listening to. So send them the link and have them listen, subscribe, follow, whatever you'd like to do. I think that would be great for me, and it'd be great for you. And it'd be great for the ocean. So thank you again for listening to this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.